With me today, it's Brendan O'Neill of Spiked Online, Sonia Sodha of The Observer, Charlotte Pickles of the centre-right think tank Reform, and Lara McNeill, who sits on Labour's ruling body. So, what is going on today?
Don't tell me to get Brexit done. The Prime Minister should be there negotiating a deal to bring back for me to support.
The Prime Minister's senior advisor says MPs concerned about public anger need to get Brexit done. Is he right? Also today, is the government looking at ways to get around the law and avoid having to ask for a Brexit delay?
It would be a piece of political chicanery that no one should ever forgive or forget.
Labour's conference was full of eye-catching policies, but can Jeremy Corbyn fight the election he wants in those key constituencies?
Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn?
Boris Johnson, definitely.
Really?
Definitely. He's standing up. What's right for us? Europe.
What's right for us?
What's right for us? Get out of Europe at the end of the day.
So lots to talk about. But of course, every day we like to talk about the latest killer quote from Dominic Cummings, who you'll know is the Prime Minister's chief advisor and who in a previous life ran the Vote Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. Today's killer quote actually came from last night when he was speaking at a book launch, and he was asked about whether or not he's enjoying all the shenanigans we've gone through.
This is a walk in the park. All the Leave team, we're enjoying this. We're going to win. We're going to leave.
So, is everyone enjoying the walk in the park? Blast, Sonia?
No, I think enjoyable is the last thing that comes to mind, watching the scenes in Parliament on Wednesday night. And sure, a bit of conflict in politics is good. Calm conflict is something that's important. We all recognise that there's disagreement, but we have to be able to disagree politely. And I thought the scenes in the Commons where you saw female MP after female MP stand up, beg the Prime Minister to dial down the rhetoric. They even said to him, some of your rhetoric is getting reflected back to us in death threats that we're receiving. Boris Johnson said, that's effectively a bunch of humbug. And when friends of Jo Cox were raising these issues, he was saying the best way to honour the memory of Jo Cox is to get Brexit done. For me, that was absolutely beyond the pale.
Well, I think we'll get into that in the rest of the program, because there's a lot to say about that.
Sure.
But, Charlotte, are you having a good time, or do you want to just
hands
over your eyes, make it go away?
I'm definitely with Sonia on this one, and I think it's really important to recognise both the point that Sonia made, which is actually the conversation, the level of debate is appalling at the moment, and that's on both sides. And I think
the level of debate in Parliament is always pretty unpleasant.
I think that's true, but it feels like it has got to a kind of an octave that we haven't seen before. But I think the other important point that I think gets lost in the discussions around language is actually we've also got paralysis. Nothing's getting done, and that's what politicians are there to do, to deliver for the country. And whilst they are bickering and worse in Parliament, we're not actually seeing improvements.
These shows like this, they don't have newspaper columns, they don't have a seat in the House of Commons. They only have the vote.
But what exactly is wrong then with Labour's position of saying we're going to put any Brexit deal to the people?
It's anti-democratic.
How can it be anti-democratic to ask voters what they think? We had a referendum, people voted, there was no concrete leave deal on the table. Now that there's a deal, or if it's going to be a no-deal option, it's absolutely anti-democratic. Boris Johnson wants to take us out of this country with no deal, I think, on the 31st of October. There is no majority in the country for that. Parliament doesn't want it to happen. It's anti-democratic for Boris Johnson to have shut down Parliament to try and get that through. How can it be anti-democratic for Labour to say we're going to put a deal to the people? You get your say.
To have a second referendum in which Remain is still an option, that's what's anti-democratic.
It's because
people have made this would be the first time in the history of the franchise in this country, which men and women struggled for so long. This would be the first time in the history of the franchise that a vote was not enacted.
Brendan,
Now, Sonia,
do you know what this says to me? Do you know what this says to me? It says to me, you are not confident of your argument.
No, it doesn't.
You are not confident that when you give people an option in a referendum, you can make the case.
Right.
You're scared of
Sonia,
losing.
hold on.
This is actually reminding me of something that we saw yesterday, which was in Portcullis House, you know, the office block where MPs work, where Carl Turner, Labour MP for Hull, happened to bump into Dominic Cummings, the Downing Street mastermind. Here's what happened.
That tone of language the Prime Minister's using is going down well in constituencies like mine. I've had death threats overnight. Should be dead. Get Brexit done. It's a disgrace. How can you get Brexit? I've had 3 opportunities to get Brexit to raise the PSD. And if I could have voted for it, I would have voted for it. Don't tell me to get Brexit done. The Prime Minister should be there negotiating a deal to bring back for me to support. Don't tell me to get Brexit done. It's only your language has been appalling. Really, really dreadful. It's very, very dreadful. And people are threatening you.
Okay, putting aside the language, which is incredibly controversial for various reasons. Sonia, so we've got the government saying, yeah, we're a government, of course we abide by the law. Then Boris Johnson saying, over my dead body, will I do an extension, which is what the law might compel him to do. I mean, how do you join those two together?
Well, they sort of appear a bit inconsistent, don't they? And there's been a lot of talk about these legal workarounds that the government might use to sort of obey the letter of the law, but get out of asking the EU
literally sending 2 letters.
Like literally sending 2 letters, although lots of legal experts say that that wouldn't be legal under the terms of the Benn Act. There's a lot of uncertainty around this, and I myself kind of think, you know, I agree with Charlotte that Parliament needs to be seen to be doing something. And actually, one thing that I think the opposition parties could do is to have that vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson and to install a temporary Prime Minister. And that would actually at least send a message to the country that something is being done. All of this is, you know, the opposition party strategy is all about how do we avoid crashing out of the EU with no deal on the 31st of October. And part of the problem is that within that alliance of MPs, there are people who want very different things to happen after that. There are some people who want a negotiated deal, some people who want a referendum, some people who just kind of want to revoke.
So that would be a step rather than an answer.
It would be a step rather than an answer, but at least it would sort of start to take us forwards. And I think if you're really interested in blocking a no-deal Brexit, because there are all these legal kind of question marks. I mean, it was very good to hear Jolly and Morm just hear him say that he doesn't think they would work, but there are questions around this stuff. The only fail-safe way, I think, of blocking no deal is to have a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, for opposition parties to unite around Jeremy Corbyn or another temporary Prime Minister, either with the purpose of requesting an extension and holding a general election, or perhaps going for the Peter Carl compromise, which is having a referendum on the withdrawal agreement versus Remain.
Now, we know someone who agrees with you on that, and here's the evidence. Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, retweeted Sonia saying exactly that same thing a few hours ago. I'm glad you're being consistent, though. You said exactly the same thing as your tweet.
It's one of those things where there's a little typo in my tweet, and then it gets retweeted by someone who's got way more followers than you, and you're like, oh, I wish I'd read that.
So this is Nicola Sturgeon basically saying she would support Jeremy Corbyn as a temporary Prime Minister to call an election and get another extension. I mean, Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn for a bit, propped up by Nicola Sturgeon. That'd be amazing for Boris Johnson, wouldn't it? Think of the posters, the adverts, the slogans. You're urging people onto the streets to smash up Vodafone and McDonald's.
Hold on, let me finish. No, let me finish my sentence. When I look at the Gilets jaunes, who have taken to the streets because Macron messed them around in relation to the eco-tax and various other things, what I continually think is, why have the British people been so patient? Now, this might sound alien to Sonia because you live in a particular world, Sonia. We all do. But there are other people.
We all live in a world where you can't go and smash up shops.
But there are people. No, but hold on. There is I'm not talking about smashing up shops. There is a fine tradition. There is a fine tradition in this country
Brendan,
of radical.
We've already seen peaceful protests on both sides.
There is a fine tradition in this country. I'm going to finish my sentence. There is a fine tradition in this country of radical protest, right from the Levellers in the 1640s to the Chartists in the 1840s to the suffragettes who did take direct action, physical action, when people's voices have been ignored. I think we.
Sonia, just help me out with the technicalities here of how the Labour Labour manifesto writing process works. So we had a vote on, say, continuing free movement, whatever happens, and abolishing private schools and taking all their assets from the people that owned them. Are they going to be in the manifesto? Will that be Labour policy?
Not necessarily. So stuff that gets passed on the conference floor isn't necessarily manifesto, Labour policy going to a general election, although, you know, it can be fairly influential. And I think actually what was interesting about this conference was if the Labour leadership had had its way, some aspects of those motions would not have been going to the conference floor.
Private school seizing.
Yeah, taking the assets of private schools, you know, behind closed doors. They
probably would like that, though, wouldn't they?
I think they know
too
that
far.
I think there are lots of things you can do around private schools that people like Michael Gove, Tory former Shadow Education Secretary and Education Secretary, support. So there's things that there are cross-party support for, and I think they're very comfortable with things like that, like charging VAT on private schools, putting a cap on the number of private school students that top universities can admit. But I think around assets, taking private schools' assets, they weren't that comfortable with that. So I think what's interesting was a lot of these really radical policies have actually come about as a result of grassroots membership rather than from the leadership. So they won't all, I don't think taking the assets of private schools is going to be in the next Labour manifesto.
You can look forward to the Clause 5 moment, which is where it all gets just turned up.
But it
too
also
expensive.
might be because they're priced wrongly, right? And there are definite problems. I mean, sure, we have good access to drugs in this country because the NHS is such a big buyer and says we're going to buy them at this price. That's certainly not the case in other countries. But one thing I will say is there are real problems. We haven't seen any new antibiotics come on the market for decades because pharma companies look at antibiotics and just don't think it's profitable. And one thing that this policy did include was saying that it was going to, there would be government funds for investment in R&D. So I think the policy does partially address some of what Charlotte was talking about.